Deep beneath the neon glare and the endless rivers of concrete that define modern Los Angeles, there lies a silent, invisible ghost. It is a city of Victorian wood and sun-dried adobe, a settlement that once thrived where the freeways now scream. We often view our metropolises as permanent fixtures of the landscape, yet Los Angeles is a unique experiment in radical transformation. It is not a city that evolved naturally, but one that was built over the wreckage of its own previous incarnations. To understand the present, we must first learn to see the void where the original city once stood, buried under the weight of progress. In the year 1880, Los Angeles stood at a trembling tipping point, caught between two conflicting identities. It was no longer the dusty, remote cattle town of the Spanish frontier, yet it had not yet become the sprawling empire of the Pacific. This was an era defined by a violent and beautiful collision, where the old Spanish-Mexican foundations were being ground into dust by the gears of American expansion. Technology was the new religion, and the landscape was the sacrificial altar upon which the old world was offered. Every street corner was a battleground between the slow pace of the past and the aggressive pulse of a future that refused to wait. If you could hover above the city in that transition year, you would see the urban skeleton revealed in a way that seems impossible today. The lingering Spanish grid, centered around the historic plaza, still dictated the rhythm of life for many, even as new American streets sliced outward like surgical incisions. The city was still small, low to the ground, and deceptively spread out, maintaining a humble profile against the vast horizon. Yet in those dusty pathways and fledgling blocks, the DNA of future sprawl was already visible. The city was learning how to expand, stretching its limbs toward the ocean, and the mountains before it even had the strength to stand. Bunker Hill emerged during this time as the ultimate symbol of human ambition and the inevitable tragedy of change. Its steep slopes began to fill with elite Victorian mansions, grand structures of wood and lace that looked out over the growing basin with an air of permanence. These homes were meant to be the fortresses of the new American aristocracy, a prestigious residential enclave that signaled the arrival of true wealth. However, the history of Bunker Hill is a cautionary tale of foreshadowing, as the very wealth that built it would eventually demand its total destruction. Within a few decades, these symbols of prestige would be labeled as blight, erased entirely from the map to make room for the steel towers of finance. In the year 1880, the physical world of Los Angeles was modest, ruled by the elements rather than infrastructure. There were no elevators to lift the spirit, no skyscrapers to scrape the clouds, only the modest height of church steeples and decorative towers. The sensory experience of the city was defined by the raw materials of the earth, from the choking dust of unpaved roads to the heavy, sweet scent of citrus blossoms. It was a place where the landscape still dictated the terms of survival, and the open air was a luxury that had not yet been choked by the exhaust of the machine. To live, there was to be intimately connected to the ground, moving at the speed of a horse and resting when the sun dipped below the hills. The historic plaza remained the cultural heart of the settlement, but in this decade, a heavy tension hung over its dusty center. It was a social fault line where recent memories of violence and unresolved cultural conflicts were still fresh and painful. This space served as a theater for the struggle between the old California order and the emerging American civic structure that sought to dominate it. Every gathering at the plaza was a delicate dance of coexistence and confrontation, a microcosm of a larger war for the identity of the region. The plaza was not just a geographic center, but a spiritual one, where the echoes of the past refused to be silenced by the noise of the new. Pico House stood then, as it does now, as a magnificent bridge between two eras, representing both Mexican prestige and American modernity. Built by the last Mexican governor of California, Pio Pico, it was a grand architectural statement intended to keep the center of power near the plaza. But around its elegant walls, the old adobe buildings were already beginning to recede, falling into ruin or being demolished to make way for brick and mortar. New power structures were taking hold, reshaping the very architecture of the city to reflect the values of the newcomers. Pico House became a lonely sentinel of a fading world, a monument to a man and a culture that were being systematically pushed to the margins. The multicultural reality of Los Angeles in the year 1880 was a complex tapestry of coexistence under extreme pressure. Mexican families, Chinese laborers, and Anglo speculators moved through the same narrow streets, but their lives were governed by invisible boundaries and racial tension. During this decade, infamous districts were intentionally dismantled and reimagined, signaling a deliberate attempt by the ruling class to sanitize the city's image. The goal was to create a version of Los Angeles that was palatable to the East Coast, a process that required the suppression of the very diversity that made the city vibrant. Inclusion was sacrificed on the altar of a polished, marketable identity that favored the few over the many. In this arid basin, water infrastructure was the true definition of authority and the ultimate source of power. The Zanja system, a network of open canals that had fed the city since its founding, revealed the raw truth of survival in the West. Survival depended less on the abstract concepts of law and more on the physical control of the flow of liquid life through the dirt. To own the water was to own the future, and the men who managed the ditches were more powerful than those who sat in the mayor's office. This was a world where a diverted stream could mean the death of a neighborhood or the birth of a fortune, making the Zanja the most vital organ in the city's body. As the population density began to increase, the ancient Zanja system became a dangerous and obsolete relic of a village past. This moment in the late 19th century captured the pivotal shift from an agrarian village to a modern, engineered city. Sanitation concerns and the need for hidden, pressurized infrastructure began to replace the exposed lifelines of the open ditches. The burial of the water lines was a metaphor for the city itself, as Los Angeles began to hide its essential functions beneath the surface. The transition was messy and expensive, but it was the necessary price for a city that intended to grow beyond the limits of its natural environment. The arrival of the railroad in the year 1876 and its expansion through the 80s shattered the geographic isolation of Los Angeles forever. No longer a distant island at the end of a long trail, the city was suddenly plugged into the national grid of commerce and movement. The train depot became a gateway of transformation, a portal through which goods, people, and revolutionary ideas flowed in a constant stream. But the tracks also brought less welcome arrivals, including illness, poverty, and the kind of ruthless ambition that views a landscape only for its extraction value. The railroad was the iron key that unlocked the city's potential, but it also invited the world to come and take what it wanted. Los Angeles began to rebrand itself during this era as a climatic cure, a place where the air itself could heal the broken body. The sick and the weary arrived in droves, encouraged by promotional materials that promised a paradise where the sun never failed and the lungs could finally expand. These health seekers arrived alongside speculators and tourists, turning the city into a strange mix of a global hospital and a high-stakes gambling hall. The gamble was fueled by cheap rail travel, making the journey to Southern California a possibility for the middle class for the first time. The city became a refuge for those looking for a second chance at life, built on the promise of a golden horizon. This influx of people triggered a housing explosion that pushed the boundaries of the city outward faster than any planner could keep up with. Speculation outpaced reality by a wide margin, as empty fields were carved into lots and sold to people who had never even seen the land. This era laid the physical and psychological groundwork for the future suburbs, establishing a pattern of development that prioritized profit over community. It was also a fertile ground for fraud, where paper towns were advertised as thriving centers that existed only in the imagination of the salesman. The city was expanding not because it needed to, but because there was money to be made in the act of growth itself. By the middle of the decade, Main and Spring Streets emerged as the shining symbols of modern aspiration, lit by the flickering glow of gas lamps. They even experimented with moonlight towers, massive steel structures intended to turn night into day over entire city blocks. This technological bravado was part of Los Angeles' burgeoning obsession with reinvention and the conquest of the natural world. To light the streets was to declare victory over the darkness and the wildness of the old frontier. These corridors of commerce became the stage where the city performed its new identity, dressing itself in the trappings of a sophisticated metropolis. The architecture of the time served as a loud declaration of intent, as Victorian commercial blocks replaced the simple functionalism of adobe. Ornate facades and heavy stone were used to bind the new neighborhoods to the downtown core, creating a visual link to the powerful cities of the East. Streetcars began to weave through the streets, physical threads that tied the expanding city together and allowed for the first true commute. Los Angeles was trying to prove that it belonged in the same league as New York or Chicago, using wood and brick to build a sense of permanence. It was a visual language of confidence, designed to hide the fact that the city was still a work in progress. Despite this intense urban ambition, the surrounding hills and the harsh desert landscape remained a dominant and humbling presence. The fragility of civilization was visible everywhere, as the tiny pockets of human effort pressed against an unforgiving and vast geography. A single dry season or a sudden flood could still bring the city to its knees, reminding the residents that they were guests in a land that did not easily yield. This tension between human desire and environmental reality created a unique psychological landscape. It was a place where people lived with one eye on the bank account and the other on the looming mountains, aware that the earth could reclaim its own at any time. The era of the great cattle ranchos came to a definitive end as the land gave way to the orderly rows of citrus orchards. Oranges became more than just fruit. They became the economic infrastructure of a new empire and a potent marketing myth. The transformation of agriculture into an industrial process allowed the city to sell Southern California as a literal paradise on Earth. The orange grove was the perfect symbol of this new world, representing a nature that was controlled, productive, and endlessly beautiful. This was the birth of the Orange Empire, a period where the landscape was redesigned to fit a specific aesthetic and economic goal. Images of these sun-drenched groves and snow-capped mountains were turned into high-powered propaganda for distant audiences. Los Angeles was no longer just a geographic location. It had become a promise and a brand, carefully crafted to appeal to the dreams of the weary. This marketing campaign was one of the most successful in human history, convincing millions to leave their homes and move to a semi-arid basin with no natural harbor. The city was sold as a place where anyone could reinvent themselves, provided they had the courage to make the trip. It was a dream manufactured in an office and delivered by the Postal Service, a masterpiece of collective imagination. The Baker Block, at the time of its construction, embodied the city's extreme bravado, a piece of European grandeur rising from the dirt of unpaved streets. It was the largest and most ornate building in the city, signaling a definitive shift in power from the old landowners to the new commercial elites. Its hallways were filled with the offices of men who were carving up the map and deciding the fate of the region. The building was a monument to the confidence of the era, a physical manifestation of the belief that Los Angeles would one day be a world capital. It stood as a reminder that the city was no longer a pueblo, but a serious player in the global economy. However, the eventual demolition of landmarks like the Baker Block underscores a central and haunting theme. Los Angeles is a city that grows by forgetting. The constant cycle of erasure and replacement means that history is often treated as an obstacle to be cleared rather than a heritage to be preserved. Freeways eventually replaced the very history they were built to connect, making reconstruction the only way for future generations to remember what was lost. This culture of amnesia allows the city to constantly reinvent itself, but it leaves a void in the collective memory of the people. To live in Los Angeles is to live in a place where the past is always being paved over to make room for a newer version of the future. By the end of the decade, the growth of the city had turned into a manic fever, a boomtown delirium that defied logic. Paper towns were platted across the desert, and speculative suburbs proliferated as people bought into visions that were often nothing more than clever deceptions. The line between a genuine visionary and a common scam artist became blurred as everyone scrambled to get a piece of the golden dream. This was a time of intense energy and profound loss, where fortunes were made and vanished in the span of a single afternoon. The city was vibrating with the intensity of its own expansion, a living organism that was growing faster than its own skeleton could support. The story of the birth of the modern city closes on a realization of what Los Angeles truly is, a masterpiece of engineering. It is a city built on the pillars of hype, water control, real estate speculation, and an unshakable belief in the power of endless sunshine. The quiet, ancient Pueblo has vanished forever, replaced by a city that is always in a state of becoming and is never truly finished. We are left with a metropolis that is a monument to human will, a place that exists because people decided it should, regardless of the cost. It is a city of layers where the past is always present in its absence, waiting for someone to look beneath the surface. Looking back at this era of radical change, we can find a lesson for our own lives in the shifting sands of Los Angeles. The story of this city teaches us that nothing is truly permanent, and that the world we see today is merely a temporary layer over what came before. It reminds us that we have the power to reinvent ourselves, but we must be careful of what we choose to erase in the process. True growth requires a balance between the ambition of the future and a deep respect for the foundations of the past. If we forget where we came from, we risk losing the very identity we are trying to build. As you move through your own world today, I invite you to ask yourself, what layers of history are hidden beneath your own feet? Are you building a life that honors its foundations, or are you living in a cycle of constant erasure? We must wonder if a city or a person can ever truly be finished, or if we are all just works in progress in an unfinished landscape. I want to wish you all good health and the clarity to see the hidden beauty in the world around you. If this journey through the ghosts of Los Angeles has resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and join our community of seekers. Until next time, keep looking beneath the surface, for that is where the true stories are waiting to be told.